Good evening. I'm Dick Clay. I'm president of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Gertrude Polk Brown lecture series. This lecture series was initiated in 1993 as a memorial to the life of Gertrude Polk Brown, and it's made possible by the continuous generous support of her family. Now, tonight I am honored to introduce David W. Blight as our Gertrude Polk Brown speaker. David is the Sterling Professor of History, which at Yale University is as high as you can get, and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale. He is the author or editor of a dozen books, including American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, and annotated editions of Frederick Douglass's first two autobiographies. He's worked on Douglass much of his professional life and has been awarded the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, among others. Like so many of us, Dr. Blight is a Midwesterner. He grew up in Flint, Michigan. He graduated from Michigan State University, and after that, he taught 7 years in Flint at a public high school. That explains his interest in public history. After that, he then went to, after Michigan State and the 7 years in Flint teaching, he went to the University of Wisconsin and got his PhD. Now it is indeed my pleasure to turn the program over to this Gertrude Polk Brown lecturer, David W. Blight.
Well, hello, everybody. And thank you, Mr. Clay, and thank you to all of the Filson staff who organized this lecture. And I wish, as originally planned, I would have been there with you in Louisville, in that beautiful lecture hall that you have. But here we are. We've all been living by this technology, it appears now, for months, and we will be for a while, but it is always amazing to me how well it works. This past week, I had a number of messages and calls, including from the Filson staff, about the song, My Old Kentucky Home, which of course, I don't need to tell you, is played at the start of the Derby. Now, I am told, I'm more than told, I was reading this in various places, that at the beginning of the Derby last week, the PA announcer at Churchill Downs invoked Frederick Douglass and a particular quotation about My Old Kentucky Home. And then they played it instrumentally on, I understand, without the lyrics. Now, I went to the speech. It's absolutely true that Douglass said this, but I just wanted to start tonight by addressing that briefly, because I've heard on email from at least a couple of people who are attending this tonight who wanted me to know I was going to be asked about it. So, anticipating those questions. It came in a speech that Douglass gave in 1855, the winter of 1855. It's entitled The Anti-Slavery Movement. Douglass took this speech on the road that winter. Note the date. It's after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's while bleeding Kansas is broken out across the borders in Kansas. He is at this point writing, yet he has not finished, his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. He will actually reprint this particular speech as an appendix in My Bondage and My Freedom. And the speech is remarkable. I won't say much about it. It's a classic creation out of Douglass's kind of sometimes embittered and sometimes humorous use of irony. He has spent some pages attacking the slave power, the political power of slavery. He has talked about how they twist language inside out and how much slaveholders love liberty, how much they love justice. and how much even they love the word love, but how they have very different definitions of it. And then he works up to this point where he says, you know, but the anti-slavery movement has grown in leaps and bounds, and it really cannot now be stopped. It is so important, it is so widespread, and so on. And he says at one point that anti-slavery now, he's very hopeful in this speech. It comes in a very hopeful way. He says, scholars, authors, orators, poets, and statesmen give it their aid, it being the anti-slavery movement. Well, some do. But he says we have the poets on our side now. The poets are with us. And then he goes on to say, it would seem almost absurd to say it, considering the use that has been made of them, that we have allies in the Ethiopian songs. By that he meant minstrel songs. Those songs that constitute our national music and the finest, our national music, and without which we have no national music. They are heart songs, he says, and the finest feelings of human nature are expressed in them. Lucy Neal, Old Kentucky Home, and Uncle Ned can make the heart sad as well as merry, and can call forth a tear as well as a smile. They awaken the sympathies for the slave, in which anti-slavery principles take root, grow, and flourish. Now, apparently it's that last phrasing that was used at Churchill Downs last week. It is now, frankly, very common in all kinds of settings and all kinds of places and at each end of the political spectrum in this country to invoke and to use Frederick Douglass. He's become almost like Lincoln in that sense. You know, the ways in which people pluck something out of Lincoln's statements and writings and to get him on their side. I suspect that's what kind of happened here with Churchill Downs. However, you should understand that Douglass was sentimental like other 19th century Americans. Yes, he mentioned Old Kentucky Home, and yes, he knew it was a minstrel song. Yes, he knew Stephen Foster had lyrics in this song that were about a slave yearning for his the old times and the old South and to go home again and so on. Now, we today might suddenly just hear that and judge it as racist and reject it, which is probably what's happening now in Louisville with this famous song before the most famous horse race in the world. But however one wants to use Douglass on this, it's nuanced. Douglass loved sentimental music. He loved folk music. And it doesn't surprise me at all that he would express such positive feelings about a Stephen Foster song. I'm happy to come back to that if somebody really wants to, but I knew I had to address that. It comes out of a brilliant speech by Douglass, and I would urge all of you to read that speech. In fact, right after he expresses that affection for these songs, he's still poking away at the slave power and its slave holders. And at one point, he trots out the golden rule. And he says, you know, slaveholders even believe in their version of a golden rule. And he says, he, the slaveholder, knows very well whatsoever he would have done to himself, but is quite in doubt as to having the same thing done to others. Interesting twist. That's kind of a Mark Twainism, but it came from Douglass. Now, in this lecture, I want to do a few things. I want to tell you a little bit about why indeed Frederick Douglass, why this subject, why he is so important in the 19th century, but also perhaps, as I'm discovering, more and more important today. I want to tell you why I wrote the book. And then I want to particularly just very quickly run through how I divided his life I did what all biographers do. I organized a life. I gave some order to it. I structured it. We do, as biographers, kind of impose an order on our subject in the past. We kind of have to. And I particularly then want to end on one major theme of Douglass's life and ideas, and that is, frankly, how much he was so steeped in biblical storytelling. Douglass was a great storyteller. Now, why I wrote this book is simple. Well, not simple, but it's got a fairly simple explanation at the start. I wrote my first book on Frederick Douglass when I was in graduate school at Wisconsin. That came out in about 1989. It was a much shorter book than this one. It was about the meaning of the Civil War in Douglass's life. Then I wrote essays on Douglass. I edited editions of his first two autobiographies. I put the Columbian Orator, that amazing book that he discovered when he was about 11 or 12 years old in the streets of Baltimore. I put that book back in print in 1997 on its 200th anniversary. Douglass had been some part of all the other books I'd written, books on Civil War memory and so forth, a book on the Underground Railroad. But I had Douglass truly out of my life. Gone. No intention of writing a full biography of Douglass until what is now 14 years ago. I went to Savannah, Georgia, to give a talk to middle and high school teachers about Frederick Douglass's autobiography, the first autobiography, the short one, which I've done many, many times. And when I arrived, my host, which was the Georgia Historical Society, their leadership said, "There's a local gentleman here in Savannah. He's a collector and he'd like to meet you." Well, long story short, that day I had lunch with and met Walter Evans. Walter Evans is an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in segregated Savannah, but he came north for his higher education. He went to Howard University first. Then he went to the University of Michigan Medical School, and he practiced as a general surgeon for close to 35 years in Detroit, which gave us something in common. I grew up just up the road in Flint, and he'd spent more than half of his life in Detroit, as we called it. At any rate, Walter, though, for Walter, his greatest passion had always been collecting African-American rare books, manuscripts, and art. In fact, his art collection is, if anything, more valuable and more famous in some ways than his book and manuscript collecting. But that day in Savannah, he took me over to his house, a beautiful 4-story brownstone on Jones Street, just off Forsyth Park, if you know Savannah. And he showed me portions of his Douglass collection on his dining room table. It was extraordinary. It was one of those, oh my God moments that historians are sometimes lucky enough to have. It is not true. I did not on the spot decide I was going to do a new Life of Douglass, not by any means. I found that so daunting. I found that just too hard to do. I took months and months actually to make up my mind about this. And finally, I decided if I don't do this, if I don't use this collection, which no one else had ever used, somebody else would. So I committed, and I spent, I've lost count, 5 or 6 Yale spring breaks in Savannah. I spent many other weeks in Savannah doing research on the Evans's dining room table. I've never worked in such an archive. It's the greatest archive I've ever been in. You sit amongst a world-class collection of African-American painting and sculpture. You are surrounded by rare books and manuscript boxes. They're all over the house. And that's where I did so much of this research. The great importance of the Evans collection is that at the heart of it are 9 very large family scrapbooks that were kept by Douglass's sons, particularly 2 of his sons, over the last 30 to 35 years of their father's life. The collection also contains a great number of personal effects, family letters and documents, but particularly at the core of it are thousands upon thousands of newspaper clippings. The family even hired a clipping service so that wherever Mr. D went, especially those last 20 years of his life, clippings tended to come back. No matter how small the town, if it had a newspaper, this clipping service found it. So therefore, that's why I decided some 13 or 14 years ago to do a new life of Douglass. And I can report the very happy news that as of this summer, it was finally announced that the Evans collection, the Evans-Douglass collection, has now been deposited and moved here to New Haven, Connecticut at the Beinecke Library, one of the great rare book and manuscript libraries in the world. It took many years to negotiate this with Walter. He is, I must say, a great businessman. And it's now a great coup that one of the Yale libraries has succeeded in getting that collection. As we speak, it is being digitized so that all the world can access it and use it. Now, why Douglass? I'll just run through some answers to that question that I've been putting together over the course of now, it's close to 2 years since the book came out. First, he was the prose poet of American democracy in the 19th century. He was a man of words. He left more to tell us about this problem, which we are talking about all the time now, the fate of American democracy. He had more to say about that in the 19th century, especially the ways in which slavery and racism and then emancipation and its aftermath affected this thing we call American democracy, this thing we call the American Republic. Secondly, with an unsurpassed eloquence, he explained the nature of slavery, both as a physical experience, but also, and I think even more important, as a mental experience. This is where the autobiographies become so important. He wrote 3 autobiographies through the course of his life and even revised the 3rd one into, in effect, a 4th. And it is there where he penetrates to the core of what slavery actually means. He did it other places as well. He expressed with a kind of terrible honesty and at times a savage irony, both the power of America's founding creeds, which he believed in, and the hypocrisy with which his country contradicted and denied those creeds. You can't find a better critique of American hypocrisy about how we've lived up to or not lived up to our creeds than Douglass, certainly in the 19th century, and there haven't been many better since. Fourthly, to see or to hear Frederick Douglass became a kind of wonder of the American world in the 19th century. In the book, I speculate whether Douglass might have traveled more miles than any other American of the 19th century. I can't know that for sure. I actually think Mark Twain may have traveled more miles, but Twain went to Asia. And so that's cheating. But also, I am convinced that more people, I can't prove this either, there's no statistical data on this, but Douglass's travels were so ubiquitous, so wide, so frequent, that I would suggest that more people heard Douglass speak than any other American of the 19th century. And particularly in the Evans scrapbooks, I have many clippings or examples of people describing the first time they saw Douglass, the first time they heard Douglass, what he looked like, what he sounded like, the baritone voice, and so on. It became a thing to do. What we talk about must-see TV or must-listen music or something. Douglass was a must-see. Fifth, he was a women's rights man before there were very many. He was not only for women's suffrage, vehemently for women's suffrage, but he also was he advocated for women's economic rights, their rights to property, in or outside of marriage, their economic rights after divorce, which was a huge question in the 19th century. He was the only Black abolitionist to speak at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. He had important and long-standing relationships with most of the great leaders of the women's suffrage movement, Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, and many others. Did not have that close a relationship with Sojourner Truth. That was testy. And of course, as some of you know, he had a terrible falling out in 1869 and 70 with Stanton and Anthony and some of the leadership of women's suffrage because women were not in the 15th Amendment. We could come back to that if you like. That was an embittered breakup between them. Now, it also needs to be said, and this is my sixth point, that you can't fit Douglass into boxes. You can't just place him in some box. And now I think even his one sentence reference to my old Kentucky home fits this part of his story as well. He could be several things at once, and he was. He could be a radical thinker and an advocate of political liberalism. He could be virtually a revolutionary at times, but then at other times, an advocate of only changing society through law and through politics. Depends on when you look. Depends on the issue, the occasion. At times, seventh, he both loved and hated his country. You can find expressions of both extremes in Douglass's ideas and his thought and his thousands upon thousands of words. Eighth, Douglass believed fully in self-reliance. He preached self-reliance to his fellow Black Americans. He advocated that they lift themselves, that they not expect handouts, so to speak. But he also fiercely fought for an activist interventionist government to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, and protect Black citizens against terror and discrimination after emancipation. There's no reason he couldn't do both, and he did do both. That is, advocating self-reliance and activist interventionist government. A ninth point I'd make about why Douglass is significant is that he forged over time, especially after he entered the political realm, although he never ran for office. He was a very political man. He forged a hard-earned pragmatism out of political experience. And that experience was of disappointment, sometimes despair, and sometimes tremendous victories for his cause. A hard-earned pragmatism, learning that politics is almost never about the perfect. 10th, though he advocated this idea of the self-made man, and the self-made man was one of his most famous post-Civil War speeches. And the American right today, political right, loves to appropriate Frederick Douglass as a self-made man. There's a book on Douglass by that very title, published by the Cato Institute, which I had a little spat about in, I think it was the New York Times. And the self-made man speech, by the way, is brilliant. It's not just about the myth of being self-made and you know, lifting yourself up and all of that. It's really about the power of the human will. But fundamentally, Douglass was not a self-made man. There were a lot of people who helped make Frederick Douglass. And a lot of those people were women, from his grandmother, his mother, whom he hardly knew, his two wives, Anna of 44 years, and Helen Pitts of 11 years, the last 11 years of his life. His daughter, Rosetta, who, when she came into adulthood, played a significant role in his life. And then many women in abolitionism and in reform movements and in women's suffrage who had tremendous influence on Douglass and supported him. A next reason is that Douglass, as well as anybody in the 19th century, seized on the King James language of the Bible and used it to deliver one of the most enduring critiques of slavery, of the coming of disunion, of the Civil War, of this enormous bloodletting, of the great story of emancipation and of Reconstruction and beyond that anybody ever delivered. He became a kind of biblical storyteller. And as I'll point out in a minute, that is less a judgment about his actual religious faith, about which it is not easy to know, than it is a judgment about how he used language. A 12th reason we're here talking about him is that if you're looking for a politics with a moral purpose at the middle of it, and I have found in the past 2 years that a great number of Americans seem to be looking for that. Some kind of moral grounding in our politics, something that gets us back to first principles in meaningful ways, something that gets us back to our creeds that makes us believe in them, despite the way we violate them. Politics with a moral purpose, it's there. Doesn't mean he was always right. It doesn't mean that he held up to his own principles at times. And last but not least, I believe Douglass became a prophetic voice. Prophet is a big word. I was afraid of it in writing this book. I was very afraid of it. I do not have formal theological training. I've read a good deal of theology. I've always been fascinated with it. I took 2 religion courses as an undergraduate, in religious studies, et cetera, et cetera. But I have some good friends who are theologians, 2 or 3 in particular. One is a neighbor here in New Haven. I won't go into all of it, but they got me on the right path in writing this book. I went to them at times and I said, help me out. What do I read on the Old Testament? What do I read on the Hebrew prophets? How do I understand how this man is using biblical story? How do I understand the King James voice? And they got me reading people like Walter Brueggemann on the Old Testament, who wrote 40 books or something. They got me reading Robert Alter. They got me reading several theologians, which really helped me. But the theologian who helped me the most, I think, came at a suggestion of my dear friend, a rabbi, Jim Conant, who again is my neighbor here in New Haven, 3 blocks away. Jim used to be head rabbi of Yale University. And he said, David, you got to read Abraham Heschel. You want to understand Douglass? You got to read Abraham Heschel. Heschel was, if not the greatest, one of the greatest Jewish theologians of the 20th century. He wrote many, many, many books. But he wrote this big tome called The Prophets. That's the book I recommend you start with on Heschel. And Heschel helped me get comfortable understanding the meaning and definitions of a prophet, at least in this Judeo-Christian tradition in which Douglass came of age in 19th century America. Heschel probably wouldn't have liked that term Judeo-Christian, but that's okay, I used it anyway. Heschel has many definitions of what a prophet is, and the more and more I read Heschel, I'd read a passage and I'd say, that sounds like Douglass. That's Douglass. Here's just one of those passages. Heschel said, quote him, "The prophet is human, yet he employs notes 1 octave too high for our ears. He experiences moments that defy our understanding. He is neither a singing saint nor a moralizing poet, but an assaulter of our mind. Often his words begin to burn where our conscience ends. An assaulter of our mind. That's what Douglass was. Prophets are not friendly. The Hebrew prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, I mean, we don't know a lot about these men. In fact, there may have been at least 2, if not 3 Isaiahs, but at any rate, they weren't fun to have lunch with. They didn't just predict. They didn't always, if they did, and they did predict, they didn't always predict right. But the prophets in the Hebrew tradition and the prophets Douglass came to use and employ and kind of love in their language were people who told us the stories we didn't want to hear about ourselves. They were the prophet is the person who finds the words to tell us about what we're doing and we don't want to hear it. They are the people who can penetrate our denial, whether it's individual or collective and national. And I finally got comfortable using the term prophet, and I put it in the title. Very quickly, I've already mentioned the first 2 big themes of this book. Actually, the first 3 I've already mentioned. When I sat down to try to organize, how am I going to go at this book? What are my big subjects about this man? And I do, of course, tell the story in chronological order. I think biography has to be done that way, although there are people experimenting with it now, doing it even moving backward. I don't quite understand that. Do you live your life backward? We think about it backward sometimes, don't we? But my first big theme is words. Douglass was a man of words. He wrote millions of words. He wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of short form editorials, which he mastered, the political editorial. He wrote 3 autobiographies. He wrote 1 novella, and he wrote thousands of speeches. Second big theme is the autobiographies themselves, which are both a subject and a source. When you're working on someone like Douglass, who wrote that much autobiography, the problem is your subject is kind of always in your way. The manipulative autobiographer is always there telling you the story he wants you to tell, and you got to find other ways to get at him by the side doors or underneath and over. My third big theme is the Bible, and I'll come back to that, his use of biblical storytelling. The fourth big theme are the ways in which Douglass went from being a political outsider, or if you will, a radical outsider while he was an abolitionist through all those pre-Civil War years and into the war, how he goes from being the radical outsider to the political insider. And here again, the Evans collection was so crucial in helping me do that. A fifth major theme, which is a big theme of all biography, is finding the balance between the public and the private life, the public and the private. Now, I made a vow with myself. I didn't quite always live up to it, but I made a vow with myself that in writing this story, I was never going to just write chapters that were solely on the public person or solely on the private person. There wasn't going to be some sort of topical chapter on the wives or the children. I tried to weave both of these together in every chapter, in every stage of his life, because that's the way we live our lives, don't we? You don't get up every day and, okay, today I'll be my public self, or today I'll just be my private self. Of course, under this pandemic, public and private have been given new norms, haven't they? And new definitions, especially if you have children. And last but not least, my sixth big theme is Douglass, the artist, Douglass, the thinker, Douglass, the writer. And I've maintained now for a very long time that if Frederick Douglass were here, and I have tried to get him here, I've summoned him so many times, but he just always slithers away. And if we ever got to ask him, sir, what were you most proud of that you achieved? Yeah, you might expect him to say, well, yeah, I don't know, maybe his children, sons in the Union Army or something. Oh, I own my own newspaper. No, I think if you pressed him a little, he would say that I became a writer. A writer. I was a slave with absolutely not a day of formal education in my life, but look at me as writer. And did he ever? Okay, I want to end on a return to this theme of Douglass as storyteller, especially the biblical storyteller. And I'll do it through an example that is in 1864, during and right after the election of 1864. That incredible wartime election. You've heard it invoked in recent months. You know, could the United States, if the United States could hold an election under the terrible circumstances of civil war, if we could do it during World War II, if we didn't cancel elections then, why would we cancel or have trouble during a viral pandemic? Or why would we even conceive of allowing a president to think about postponing an election or disrupting it in some ways? Well, they didn't disrupt the 1864 election, but it was a barn burner. This was Abraham Lincoln's reelection, of course. And that winter and spring of 64, 65, there was a movement in the Republican Party to dump Lincoln, as some of you Lincoln readers and historians well know. A movement from the left that was trying to resurrect John C. Fremont, a more radical abolitionist candidate, so some thought. And Frederick Douglass even flirted with this dump Lincoln campaign a little bit, but he didn't stay with it very long. The other side, the Democratic Party, the parties were quite shifted. Well, actually, absolutely shifted in the middle of the 19th century. The Democratic Party that year ran what I always tell my students was the most racist and white supremacist presidential campaign in American history until the next one, because 1868 got even worse. They ran a campaign against Lincoln and the Republicans that was blatantly racist. They called Abraham Lincoln Abraham Africanus the first, implying that he was black. They put out cartoons showing these miscegenation balls, so-called, run by the Republicans in New York City. In fact, the very word miscegenation was created in that campaign, meaning race mixing. They attacked Lincoln as an N-word lover and all Republicans and so on in the same way. It was wedge politics. They painted the Republicans as the party of emancipation. Now that part was true. Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863. That's a long time ago now. That's a year and a half ago, and a year and a half of terrible warfare. And that summer, the war was in stalemate. Stalemate in Virginia, stalemate in Georgia, and stalemate in Mobile Bay, Alabama. Well, Lincoln called Frederick Douglass to the White House in mid-August, 1864. They had met the previous year in August of 63 when Douglass went to Washington and insisted on meeting with Abraham Lincoln about the ugly and terrible discriminations that were being employed against black soldiers. But this time Lincoln invites Douglass as kind of the principal spokesman of Black America and one of the greatest abolitionists. He brings Douglass to Washington and he asked Douglass to help him set up a scheme that would funnel, this was the idea. Douglass was supposed to lead a band of agents. He would be assisted, he was told, by the War Department and the Army to funnel as many slaves out of the Upper South and the border states before Election Day, so that as many slaves as possible were in free status, some kind of legal free status, before Election Day, in case Lincoln lost the election, which he, in August of 64, fully believed he probably would. The Democrats are running George B. McClellan, the former general of the Union Army, of the Army of the Potomac. And the Democrats were promising some kind, although we'll never know for sure, of negotiated peace with the South. Douglass was stunned. He's being asked to create some kind of John Brown escape schemes out of the Upper South by Abraham Lincoln. Douglass went back to Rochester, New York, where he lived. He started to set up, groups of agents. He emailed, he telegraphed and wrote letters to people. But he was saved by the war. He was saved. This scheme never came off, nor perhaps could it have come off. But he was saved by the fall of Atlanta in the first week of September. Sherman takes Atlanta on September 3, and it was the biggest news of the war. Admiral Farragut had taken Mobile Bay on August 25th. Huge news. The biggest naval battle of the Civil War. And General Sheridan, Phil Sheridan, was moving down through the Shenandoah Valley with huge victories. Victories out on battlefields turned the tide of Northern morale, which was suffering horribly with the ghastly casualties of 1864. Now, Douglass wanted to go campaign for Lincoln, but they wouldn't let him. Wedge politics. They're trying to sidestep this image of the party of emancipation. They don't want this famous black man out there campaigning for Lincoln, so he doesn't. They won't let him. But after Election Day in Rochester, New York, where Douglass lived, and Lincoln wins re-election, it's an extraordinary victory. Lincoln took 55% of the vote. Douglass went where he had gone so many times. He went to the Spring Street AME Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a black church in Rochester, on the Sunday after the election. Packed house, people all outdoors around the church. Douglass took and by the way, he'd had that pulpit many, many, many times. He'd given a whole lecture series there on Sunday afternoons for years. He went to Spring Street AME. He opened that speech by a simple biblical story. This is classic Douglass. He didn't have to cite his text, not with this audience. He just said, you know the story of Noah in Genesis. After the flood seems to have subsided and the ark comes aground somewhere, Douglass says, do you remember? Noah wondered, and Noah sent a dove out of the ark, and the dove returned, and the dove had an olive branch in its beak. And Noah wondered, is it possible? Is it possible? Is the flood over? And so he sent the dove out again. Douglass is telling this story in his own words. And of course, the dove does not return. So Noah takes the courage, he takes the tarp off the ark, and lo, the world was green. Behold, the world had been renewed. What has Douglass just done? He's gone to the oldest rebirth metaphor in Western civilization, Noah's Ark. The destruction of all life, and then the preservation of a kernel of a new world. That was the metaphor Douglass employed for what Lincoln's reelection, and now, even more important, the likelihood of the prosecution of this war to its completion and to the great achievement of Black freedom. Now, I can't end there though, because in that speech in Rochester, Douglass announced that the following Sunday, he was going to go back to Baltimore. Baltimore, Maryland is, of course, where Douglass escaped from in 1838. He'd never been back to Baltimore. And he was going to go back in major part because Maryland had just held a referendum about whether to become a free state. Maryland was, of course, a slave state. And then Election Day, and that first week in November, Maryland held a referendum, and it was very, very close. It was something like 20,800 to 20,300. I forget the exact numbers. I should memorize those. Barely passed. But Douglass announced, I'm going back to the free state of Maryland. And he does. And he went with paparazzi in tow. He went with press in tow. It's why we know so much about what happened. He went to Fells Point in Baltimore, where he had spent 9 of his 20 years as a slave, where he had really come of age, from where he had escaped in 1838. And he went to the Bethel AME Church on Dallas Street in Fells Point, a black church, to speak. Huge crowd. They couldn't fit into the building. They're all over the streets. But when Douglass walked up to the front door of the Bethel AME, he's met by a woman. Her name was Eliza. She said, hello, Frederick. I'm your sister, Eliza. They hadn't seen each other since 1836. She was his older sister. She had lived her life in slavery till the late 1850s, when by a means I won't tell you, she had purchased her freedom. She had had 8 children. She named one of them for her famous brother. Her last name was Mitchell. She had a son named Frederick Douglass Mitchell. He grabbed her by the arm. It's not even clear he recognized her. He grabbed her by the arm. They walked up the main aisle of the church. We're told that the altar of the church was decked out in American flags. And Douglass got up and he did the same thing he'd done back in Rochester with a twist. He opened with the Noah's Ark story. Noah sent the dove out. Dove returns. Noah sent the dove out again. Dove does not return. Noah takes the tarp off the ark, and lo, the world is renewed. Same text, same story, same rebirth metaphor. But then Douglass said, but today that I am back on the free soil of Baltimore, I, a former slave, I am the dove. I am the rainbow on the sky, he says. Now that takes chutzpah to insert yourself into the Noah's Ark story. But note what he's done. He's converted that oldest rebirth story in Western civilization into the story first of himself, his people, and his nation. That's what Douglass was so good at. He was our prose poet and prophet of American democracy. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to questions, and I would like to ask Emma to put up some images now. I've just brought along 4 or 5 photos of Frederick Douglass, and while we do the Q&A, if Emma, you would bring up the earliest photo of Douglass, and then just every few minutes, you might just go to the next image. But this, I can, well, that's okay. Stay on that first one first, if you would, Emma. And I may say a word or two about each of these photos as we discuss them. But Dick, over to you, and I'd love to hear what some of the questions may be.
Thank you, David. I think maybe the first one is from someone who may, and many of us don't know Douglass as well as you do. What would you tell us about his life, the formative issues that made him who he became?
Well, there you have to read these autobiographies, because slavery made Douglass. He's 20 years a slave before he escaped. 11 of those years out on the eastern shore of Maryland, and 9 of those years in Baltimore. Now, if he hadn't been sent to Baltimore, actually 2 different occasions he's sent to Baltimore for extended periods of time, we wouldn't know about him. In Baltimore, he's involved in an urban kind of slavery. He worked in the docks, he worked in the shipyards, he worked in maritime jobs. And in Baltimore, he also got very much involved in the free Black community. Baltimore, at the time Douglass escaped in 1838, had about 3,000 slaves. And it's a major seaport, major shipbuilding seaport. It had about 3,000 slaves, but it had 17,000 free blacks. Now, these people lived under total, discrimination. They had no civil or political rights, but they built communities. They built an economy. They built churches. They had debating societies, churches, etc. That's how he meets Anna Murray Douglass, whom he will then eventually marry. And he got involved in that community, which helped him mature. It had also a good deal to do with how he came by more vigorous uses of language. He attended 4 different churches in Baltimore, 2 of them led by white ministers, 2 of them led by black ministers, and he has a lot to say about them. So being in a city had so much to do, 1, with why he could escape, but 2, how he matured. And he had a relative kind of liberty of movement. Now, I'd also say that to the question, Dick, of what forms him, slavery was a kind of, without getting too hyperbolic, a kind of iron in Douglass's soul. It also left in him, I think, and I say this in various ways in the book, and I try to show it in his writing, it left in Douglass a tremendous rage. It left in him a tremendous anger. But what Douglass had, and nobody's born with this ability with language. You have to learn it and cultivate it and practice it, of course, whether it's speaking or writing. But he was able to process that anger with his pen and with his voice, without which, who knows what would have happened to him? Who knows how he might have, to some degree, just psychologically spun out of control? I could add many other elements to this. Douglass comes into early adulthood there in Massachusetts, a young man who found it very difficult to trust people, for good reason. He didn't make close friendships very well, especially at first. He was hypersensitive to slights, either racial slights, but also slights about his background, that he had no education, that he was born and raised a slave. But a ferocious desire. He had a ferocious desire to learn, to read, to cultivate his mind, and especially to read history. And I should say theology. Douglass, by the way, later on in life, after he collected books for many, many, many years, and I got access to his entire book collection as it survived. The National Park Service has it in a warehouse in Landover, Maryland. He became a voracious reader of Shakespeare, a voracious reader of the English Romantic poets. He, like almost everybody in the 19th century, was a lover of Dickens. Anyway, he wanted to see himself, and he had every right to eventually, as a literary man. I think what you have in a Douglass here, and he cultivated this even while he was a slave, and the book is full of examples of this. As a kid, he did what every kid does. He wanted to find what he was good at. And what this guy was good at is language, words, oratorical and written. It became his weapon.
Which leads me to another question. You suggest that he was proud of being a writer, and indeed he was. Do you have any sense of his relationship with the other great white writers of the 19th century, like Thoreau, Emerson, Alcott, Whitman, Dickinson?
Sure. Yes. In fact, Emma, you might put up the next slide. It gets us into the 1850s and a little beyond. Well, he did have a relationship with Emerson. They not only met, they shared a platform together 2 or 3 times. There's not much correspondence between them, but clearly Douglass reads Emerson. And he makes Emerson a big deal of the famous self-made man speech because of Emerson's famous essay on self-reliance, which was a very important essay to Douglass. He had no relationship with Thoreau that I know of, none with Melville. It's a shame, although he and Melville were actually in New Bedford, Massachusetts during part of the same year. before Melville went to sea. There's no evidence they ever met. And Douglass was unknown then. He was just a worker down on the docks. No relationship with Hawthorne, who wasn't an abolitionist anyway, nor with Dickinson. I mean, hardly anybody had close friendships with Emily Dickinson, and nor with Whitman. It's a shame. These great Renaissance writers that we all love to read, Douglass was fully aware of all of them, but only Emerson in that, pantheon did he actually develop a relationship with. He had deep and strong and sometimes conflicted relationships with many abolitionists, almost all abolitionists, who were themselves writers of all kinds, especially William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and many, many others. And then with Black abolitionists, especially the writer and actually his best friend, James McCune Smith. Now, after the Civil War, it's a little bit of a different story. Douglass becomes the kind of famous man everybody wants to meet. And he did develop relationships later with Gilded Age writers, although, again, you look in vain for a relationship with Mark Twain. God, I wish I had found, the day that Douglass and Twain just got together and told some stories together and somebody recorded them. But I'm afraid that didn't happen.
Another question.
Sure.
His rage is in his autobiographies and his speeches.
Yeah.
But he's an incredible role model to demonstrate what can do with rage and maybe what some have termed as enslaved human beings, post-traumatic stress disorder.
I'd never employed that term in the book, but I do employ the word trauma. I don't think there's any question. Douglass came of age then in early adulthood with a rage in his heart, with scars on his soul. He'd experienced a lot of physical abuse, brutal beatings while he was a slave, but more important to him, and he says it many times, were the humiliations. The humiliations at the heart of racism. The humiliations about the whole idea that Black people weren't capable of this, or that. It's why writing, I think, was so important to him, because we got to remember here, for a Black man to publish an autobiography in the 1840s, he wasn't the first to do it, but in the 1840s and 1850s, is to do this in a world where most white people think that Black people can't write and don't have a history to tell. They really don't believe that. And he is a role model. It's one of the reasons the narrative, the first autobiography, is now, took a long time for this to happen, but is now so widely taught, actually across the world, because it is a coming of age story. It's very much a coming of age story, and the struggles against every kind of obstacle you can imagine, physical, but even more importantly, psychological obstacles. Moral obstacles. The society has built this moral wall against you. How do you fight with it? How do you defeat it? How do you use language to keep hope? One of the things anyone who reads Douglass will find, and again, I'm not trying to claim he's some kind of Horatio Alger model for anything, but one of the things you'll find the more and more you read Frederick Douglass, autobiography, speeches, or otherwise, is this man had, although it fell apart sometimes, he had a desire to keep hope in his heart, no matter what happened to him. And that came from two sources, at least two sources. One was the secular Enlightenment. He really did embrace and believe in America's founding creeds. He once called Jefferson's first principles precious ore. They were like iron ore from the ground. They didn't belong to any one person or any one group. They belonged to everybody. They were human rights. They were natural rights. But then the other source was biblical. It was a kind of belief that slavery ultimately could not survive in a world of moral behavior and of Christian ideology. Now, that's sorely tested, of course, isn't it? Over and over and over and over. And after the Civil War, it's tested in some ways even more than it was before the Civil War, down to the end of Douglass's life. Because, see, you got to remember here, this guy is born in 1818 out in the, the sandy backwater of the Eastern Shore, but he's going to live all the way to 1895. He's going to live till modernity. He's going to live till steamboats cross the Atlantic in 8 days. He's living till way beyond the telegraph. He's living till when they have the phonograph recordings, although he was never recorded. He lives till the age of the telephone. He even took hope, in fact, from all the changes in technological modernity. He said, in a world of steam and in a world of the telegraph and in a world of new communications that defeats time and space, slavery and racism cannot endure. Well, racism has endured. But he also understood why.
Here's another question for you, and I'm posing this one.
Okay.
The Filson has a history of 130 some odd years.
Mm.
It was put together by a group of white men, some of whom were veterans for the Union, some veterans for the Confederacy, looking for, I think, in some ways, a way out. What they collected focused largely on history that went back to the Revolution. And as a result, there are gaps in the Filson's collection. The collection, I can assure you, is magnificent. It takes your breath away. It's so good. But there are gaps, and those gaps deal with the perception of Native Americans. They deal with perhaps an absence of a Black narrative. They're rich collections that deal with enslavement of human beings, but it's from the viewpoint of the people who enslaved, by and large. What advice would you give a historical institution like the Filson, as an institution that wants to help the community, outreach the community, and be open to history in all of its forms? What would you tell us to do to fulfill our mission?
Wow. Well, I suppose if resources allow, you can begin to alter or revise your collecting policies. You could begin collecting perhaps a more modern material, although maybe it is only a 19th century collection. You can be much more concerted about trying to collect Native American material and African American material, perhaps especially given the recent events in Louisville with Breonna Taylor, etc. But I think more important would be to start with your own staff, your board, and so on, and maybe you've already done this. Start with an investigation that helps you understand why these gaps happened. It's not surprising. If this was founded by Union and Confederate veterans who were almost all white, or presumably white, you said this was their way out, maybe out of dealing with that experience, of dealing with the issues of the Civil War. You may know, Dick, I wrote a book called Race and Reunion, the Civil War in American Memory. And indeed, in the 50 years after the American Civil War, this society, North and South, border states everywhere, went to great extents to try to remember and forget. And forgetting is always a part of remembering. And we have to visit that first. Why did that happen? May lead you then to filling in, not just the desire to fill in these gaps, but ways of finding material in those gaps. I don't think you have to be utterly instrumental about just trying to collect African American material. You probably have to simply engage the community beyond Louisville as well, and make the Filson a place people want to deposit material about African American life, from family history, which I know you have a great collection about, to larger political history. But it can be done. And, you know, the Filson has a great, great tradition. And other collections, other libraries have done this as well. I can give you an example and put my friends and colleagues here at Yale on the spot. That this is not a secret now. But that Evans collection that I mentioned is now on deposit here at the Great Beinecke Library. The man who originally owned most of, not quite all, but most of that collection once lived in New Haven, Connecticut, way back in the 60s and even early 70s. The person from whom Walter Evans bought that collection originally offered it to Yale, and they turned it down.
Wow.
Back then, I guess these old scrapbooks, it's probably maybe they just didn't look carefully, or that, you know, around 1970, you know, Frederick Douglass, you know, he wrote a slave narrative. What else was there? So, you know, the times changed, to say the least. And Walter got it cheaply back then. But the Beinecke didn't get it cheaply. So you know, the interest now, and a great example here, of course, is what the African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. was able to achieve under the intrepid leadership of Lonnie Bunch. They started that great museum with no collection at all. None. They were going to be a museum that was about exhibitions, and it is, but they had no collection at first. They put out the word. Of course, Lonnie raised a lot of money to do this. Most of it not from the government, but they put out the word that they were collecting African American, you know, Americana by African Americans, material culture by African Americans, letters, documents, experiences, sites, places, everything. That's how they got the Nat Turner Bible. That's how they got so many precious items. People had these things, but they were never quite sure where they wanted to give it to. Now, you know, they had this sway going for them that they were going to be on the National Mall, and it was this national museum, and it was a, you know, it had all that element. But people need to be cultivated and ask. You know that. Everyone in the business of libraries, museums, and research centers knows that. And it takes time.
We're going to end with this because you have answered an important question. And I want to assure everybody who's on this.
Emma, move the slides if you would, especially the next couple. Yeah, that one's a gorgeous one. 1857, by the way. Go ahead.
I want to tell everyone who's tuned into this that the Filson's mission is indeed to collect from the entire community, to deepen and enrich its collections, and to listen. We've got a lot of listening to do, I think, as an institution, to the African American community and to other communities in Louisville and the state and the region who felt marginalized. And part of our mission is to collect materials that will have lasting benefit to future generations from all of you, but we have to listen and hear and learn. So thank you. And David, thank you so much for this.
It's my honor. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you at the next one.